Hello, I'm Dr. Greg Mauck. Thanks for joining me. I'm here in my hometown of Sullivan in Moultrie County, Illinois, in east-south central Illinois. What I wish to discuss with you tonight is an issue that's hotly debated by two local historians for quite a while. It's the existence and prevalence of the movement of Copperheadism in Moultrie County during the Civil War. One of these historians looks at the evidence and concludes that yes, obviously, Copperheadism was quite prevalent. The other looks at the evidence and considers Copperheadism to be mostly a myth pushed by the Republican Party. The historical question would seem to be resolved rather easily, and I felt that it was with the primary evidence I was able to find. So Copperheadism did seem to be quite prevalent in Moultrie and the surrounding areas during the Civil War. Now, the political landscape in 1860 didn't produce just a schism in the country, but it produced a schism in the Democratic Party as well. Part of the Democrats, like Stephen Douglas, supported the war in Lincoln and were called War Democrats. The other part opposed the war and opposed Lincoln, thinking he was a tyrant and destroyer of the Constitution. So they were called the Peace Democrats, but were soon labeled Copperheads. Copperheads were a snake that was thought to be really vile because it tended to strike without warning. But the Copperheads soon adopted this name for themselves because they liked it thought that they might just strike without warning. So Sullivan in Moultrie County, like most of the lower Midwest, was populated mainly by people from the South and Southeast, mainly Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas. So that means that this area, and really the lower Midwest in general, had a lot of sympathy for and connection to the South. So that produced a very fertile ground for Copperheadism. We're here looking out over the West Ocal River, west of Sullivan. This area in 1860 would have been much more heavily wooded. During that time, the local Copperhead groups used this area and an area east of town near Asa Creek to drill their militia for the Copperhead movement. As I mentioned earlier, there's plenty of primary source evidence to conclude that Copperheadism was indeed very prevalent and very active in Moultrie County during the Civil War. The two best types of this evidence are personal letters written during the time and then also newspaper articles from the time. One source I had access to, a personal correspondence, was a trove of 143 letters written from a family in Sullivan to their two sons away at the war. For example, in one of those letters, it was reported to one son that Nelson Powell was home on leave and was accosted by a group of Copperheads who accused him of being a spy sent here to spy on the local Copperhead movement. They reported that butternut badges were being worn to support the Confederacy in town. They reported the Copperheads are drilling on the West Fork of the Ocal River right here. Billy Porter was assaulted last evening, they wrote. Hogue walked up to him, called him a damned abolitionist, and struck him. The Copperheads have a battalion drill in Sullivan tomorrow. They're expecting Copperheads from all the adjoining counties. They drilled near Sullivan last Sunday. The Copperheads had a celebration in Sullivan. A large number came and they brought their guns and drilled near the fairgrounds. Then they marched through town shouting for Jeff Davis. Now, this is only some of the commentary of these letters. There's much, much more. They mention people by name in specific places and specific situations. So there's every reason to consider these reports accurate. They point to a very active Copperhead presence here in Moultrie County. Now, these letters are preserved in a historical society and have been transcribed exactly, including all the non-standard spellings and grammar. Abundant evidence for Copperhead activity is also found in newspaper articles. Now, unfortunately, there are no newspapers from Sullivan or even all of Moultrie County extant from the Civil War period, but there are plenty from the surrounding counties right around here. For example, Mattoon, 15 miles east of here, had the Mattoon Gazette. They actually still do have the Gazette. It reported a lot on Sullivan activities and a lot on the Copperhead activities. For example, an article detailed a march of about 3,000 Copperheads into Mattoon, headed by 600 footmen from here in Moultrie County and Shelby, which is about 4 miles that way. They were armed as infantry and led by a local person from Sullivan who was a well-known Copperhead leader. There were 300 horse cavalry. There were 200 horse-pulled wagons full of people. They marched through Mattoon and met at a grove right south of Mattoon and were addressed by John R. Eden, who was from Sullivan. He was a congressman and a judge from Sullivan and a very well-known Copperhead. Second article describes a Copperhead meeting in Sullivan as a mass meeting. Now, again, this paper, being a Unionist and Republican paper, would not have reported that it was a mass meeting unless it actually was. In July of 1864, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune came to Sullivan to report on the Copperhead movement here. Now, the Tribune then, as now, is the most prominent paper in Chicago. He, the author of the piece, concluded that the people of Sullivan were Southerners who were all a bunch of Copperheads and that they hated abolitionists and shouted for Jeff Davis. So that's exact corroboration of what we saw in those personal letters. So again, it shows that that is a truthful situation there. The most important event associated with the Copperhead movement in this area of southeast central Illinois occurred in Charleston, which is on the other side of Mattoon, about 25 miles from here, and it was the March 1864 Charleston riot. Now, there was often a lot of problems in Charleston from soldiers getting off of the train there to go to the bars and local Copperheads. Well, at the end of March, the Copperheads were ready for the soldiers, and once all the fisticuffs started, shooting started along with it. And they estimate about 100 rounds were shot off, and by the end of that time, 6 Union soldiers were dead, as well as 2 Copperheads and an innocent bystander. Now, this was very well documented in all the newspapers of the time, all across the country, and is thought by many people to be a defining moment of the Copperhead movement. So another type of eyewitness testimony that I had to look at are memoirs written by eyewitnesses, but after the fact. I had access to one of those, and in it, the man recording his memoirs writes of a time when the Copperheads from Sullivan were going to raid an area of Moultrie County that was much more Unionist. Well, this man was the leader of one of the groups that repelled the Copperheads and stopped that. He related this to his son, who was a university professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who recorded this and later published it in a book. So again, we can be quite sure of the truthfulness of that statement. So this is just a small portion of the approximately 40 examples of primary source evidence I've collected for this project. And this evidence shows that there can be no doubt that the Copperhead movement was very prevalent and very active in Moultrie County throughout the Civil War. Now, this project wasn't just useful from a purely historical point of view. It also shed a lot of light on issues that are somewhat unique to local historical research. For one, it showed that in doing local historical research, one must be cognizant that there may be people in there that are very personally and emotionally involved in the subject of study. That is issued in the dispute I mentioned. One of the historians is a direct descendant of the family of letter writers. She doesn't want her family being portrayed as liars or fearmongers. The other, who claims to doubt any real existence of Copperheadism in Moultrie County, is actually the great-grandson of the Congressman John R. Eden we mentioned. He considers the Chicago Tribune article to be a piece of satirical fiction. One wonders that's because his great-grandfather was referred to in the article as the Confederate congressman. One might ask if he's just simply ashamed of his family history. The second major issue is actually applicable to historical research as a whole, but it seems particularly germane at the local level, and that is how much credence to give to different classes of evidence. I judge letters written by the other family members be the highest class of evidence. They were written purely to inform to a single person, not an audience, and so there'd be no reason to lie or stretch the truth. In addition, the letters I had access to were written across 3 or 4 years by 4 different people and were completely consistent in their messaging. Newspaper accounts were also judged to be accurate. You always have to take a newspaper account with a grain of salt, but they have to be relatively accurate at least to maintain a readership. And like biblical apologetics, when papers publish things that reflect positively on their opponents and negatively on their side of things, you can be pretty sure you're reading the gospel truth. The third point I'd like to make is that local history, historical research brings history to life. It gets down to the nitty gritty and fills the gaps. One can read about the Copperhead movement in a dry history, but to hear about how James Harper over in Shelby County had to hide in a hedgerow to avoid being beaten by the Knights of the Golden Circle brings alive that palpable fear. And when one hears about on the Sullivan Courthouse Square at the exact point I was recording earlier, a sign was posted that forbade soldiers home on leave from wearing their uniforms in public. Well, you can feel the tension in the town when you hear things like that. So up to the Civil War, this area here was swamps and saturated prairie soils. It was impossible to farm. It was a malaria-infested hellhole full of crawling with snakes, rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and yes, copperheads. Behind me is one of the hundreds of dredging canals that was dug a couple decades after the war to drain the swamplands and the prairies, creating some of the most productive farmland in the world. Draining the swampland implying that fields changed the environment here, and along with the water, the malaria and the snakes are pretty much gone. Lincoln's resounding election victory in 1864 also changed the environment, draining the momentum and energy from the Copperhead movement, which was soon swallowed up in the progression of time, the same way the swamps would be a few years later. Thanks for joining me.